We did this about 10 years ago, and Mike had a presentation, and David Jackson followed him with a local presentation, and we're going to do it again because we haven't done it, and this is our mission, to preserve this history, to present it, to record it, and do whatever we can to promote keeping radio alive.
Let me welcome you. Now, most of you maybe haven't thought about this, but it's for centuries, many hundreds of years, people have wanted to send messages and receive messages. They wanted to communicate. They didn't really know what it was called, but they started out with things like drums or smoke signals, right? Or flags between shore stations and ships. Obviously, all the visual methods were limited by line of sight, and the audio methods, the drums that you would send to the next drummer, who would send it to the next drummer, and probably make a mistake in sending it, and probably a lot of civilizations were wiped out because of bad smoke signals and things like that. Then in the mid-18th, 19th century, we had the wired telegraph, and the wired telephone followed 20 or 30 or so years later. Now, the disadvantage, of course, with the wired telegraph and telephone were that hostile Indians would cut the wires. Other companies that were against the companies with the telegraph would cut the wires. The telephone, of course, what was good in the cities, but it took until 1915 and an invention by DeForest using his vacuum tube as an amplifier, selling it to the phone company for transamerican phone calls. Well, all of this led to Marconi, who had a yacht and spent a lot of time on the sea, and he wanted safety for ships at sea, and so Marconi took the work of several European inventors, the Chrs, the Maxwell, people who were experimenting, and academics who were writing about sending signals using a spark through the ether. They didn't know much about it. Marconi put a system together. He was like a systems engineer. He put it all together, and it worked. Transmitting voice without wires at last. And this is right around 1900, the beginning of the century. But it was not broadcasting. It would really make wireless broadcasting possible, but it really wasn't broadcasting. As a matter of fact, Marconi even said, I like the idea it's code because it's secret and people can't really understand it. And so we like that. So Marconi was not a broadcaster, but he was an important cog in the kinds of things that we're doing. Well, I have a definition on the screen here, which I apologize, maybe you cannot see. The dictionary definition using the two words broadcast, to cast broadly, right? The dictionary calls it in there as an adjective in 1767, in 1813 as an agricultural term, where you were broadcasting seeds or sowing. Sometimes we say sowing seeds, but they use the word broadcast. And according to this, 1921, the reference to radio broadcasting. So that's what the dictionary believes. And in 1921, 22, those were really the formative years in radio broadcasting. So what we're talking about, broadcasting, not the seeds, we're talking about sending information or entertainment from one to many. In other words, from a radio station to a bunch of people with radios. And they weren't responding, but it was a one-way to one to many. Okay, so let's think about pre-1900. But first of all, this research came from the work I did for my books, which you see up there, the one on Charles Harold, DeForest, The Radio Boys and Girls, which is really about broadcasting in the early 1920s, and a book I did for Columbus, Ohio radio stations called Columbus Radio. And I did that because that's how I got my start in radio. I was a disc jockey in Columbus, Ohio, while going to Ohio State, and it's a good thing I got a college degree because radio was just starting to die out there. So anyway, that's to introduce myself. So pre-1900, we'll start with that in broadcast. People thought about broadcasting. It was conceived, but it really wasn't possible in many ways to do things because there was limited technology. The only real technology, and again, all of these technologies are used by the next thing, right? Like the broadcasters used the telephone carbon transmitter as its first way of getting voice into a crude spark or arc transmitter, and they used the telephone earphone the thing that you listened to back then. It was odd looking, as the earphones for wireless listening and broadcasting. You could hook the telephone thing up to a crystal set, and you could actually broadcast. Well, there's some examples of broadcasting, and these are there's one. These are 1870s, 1880s periodicals which talk about people wanting broadcasting but not really knowing how to do it. This one shows a bunch of people sitting around a table. I mean, you probably can't see it, but imagine people sitting around a table with a bunch of little loudspeakers. And again, this is wired. In Brussels, there was a system where using the telephone wires into people's homes where they could get stock and business news. And I don't know how many subscribers or audience there was, but in a sense was a broadcasting before you could actually broadcast, right? Because there were no radio stations, and it was just a crude idea. You used a wired telephone. A bunch of people with a predetermined time would pick up the receiver and listen to the news, okay? And this thing here, the Daily Graphic from, I believe it is 1877, called Terror of the Telephone, and it shows an orator, and if you see little tiny wires going to various constituencies, businessmen, people on the farm, Indians, people plowing the plains, and the idea was that this is actually a broadcasting system. I mean, it isn't radio broadcasting as we know it, but then again, internet broadcasting and streaming from one to many is broadcasting, but there isn't necessarily a transmitter involved other than the one maybe from your cell tower or your Wi-Fi, but it isn't the same. But it is the same. So, we talk today about, radio is dead. Well, it isn't necessarily dead, because radio is, after all, content and audience, and you get radio on your cell phone, and you can obviously also get it on a radio, although when I ask my university students, I used to ask them, because I retired, but I used to ask them, how many have a newspaper, how many read a daily newspaper? This was 10 years ago. No one raised their hand, right? We're the news. How many here read a daily newspaper? Raise your hand. See, you're it. Well, we know about age and stuff like that, and I also read one too. But I read it almost entirely on a tablet. I don't read any paper newspaper, but I read it on my phone. And then the other question I asked is, how many have a radio? Well, nobody raised their hand. And I said, well, how about the car radio? Well, some other hands went up. I mean, students really don't understand what a radio looks like, because I had radios in my office at San Jose State, and the students would come in and they say, what is that? I mean, it would be very, obviously, it's a little 5-tube All-American clock radio I had as a display. They don't know. All right. So, and there were some other things, right, and there's some other ideas, too, to use a way of sending voice without wires. Stubblefield tried ground conductivity, and he also tried air transformer, 2 coils, and the farther away you got, the weaker the signal was. But also what Summerfield did, and this was right around 1900, and they have a plaque in Murray, Kentucky, as you drive in, the home of broadcasting. But what he basically did was put ground rods at spaced intervals, used a carbon microphone and a very powerful battery on one end, and an earphone on the other end. And if you yelled really loudly, you could probably make it out, as long as it had just recently rained, because it needed ground conductivity. Not radio, no. It wasn't, but it showed that men and women and people wanted to be either part of sending out content that they owned or had or liked to an audience that also liked that content. It happened fairly quickly, so we'll look at that. So from the invention of radio, and I guess we could say, using Marconi and some of the scientists back before pre-1900, I want to talk about Marconi and Fessenden, DeForest, Harold, and Conrad in the 2 decades leading up to broadcasting. Their technology, their motivation, their contributions to so-called, what I'm calling the pre-broadcast era. Now, Marconi, as Bart talked about, decades leading to broadcasting, Marconi made practical use of early wireless theories of Hertz and Maxwell and other scientists. He wasn't a broadcaster, and he looked only where the wireless or the wireless telegraph went, or the wired telegraph, and what was wrong with it. So that sort of thing. We look at Fessenden, who was a professor from Canada. He used an alternator, and Fessenden in 1906 claims the famous Christmas Eve broadcast, although some researchers are questioning that because it had no publicity. Only what Fessenden wrote about 1930 when he wrote his memoirs. He said, I did this on Christmas Eve 1906. I played the violin, my wife sang, so on and so forth. Some people say, well, maybe that didn't happen because it wasn't in the newspaper. But a year or less later, Fessenden actually did something similar. He broadcast music from his laboratory to ships at sea because they were the only ones with radios. And Fessenden obviously it got in the paper that time. So he really did do it. Fessenden often said, I play sometimes records into a microphone to rest my voice, because he and, for example, DeForest and others from this era were trying to do what Marconi did for the wired telegraph. That is, they were attempting to invent a system of wireless telephone, to do for the telephone what Marconi did for the telegraph. So these people were using things that we call broadcasting, even though they weren't really doing it. Now, DeForest claimed in a New York Times interview in 1906, sent out a grand opera by wireless telephone. His technology was pretty much what existed at the time. So if you look closely, and I apologize if you can't see the screen, but if you look closely, it's all the media that came first, right? I mean, if you look at radio programming as all of the entertainment that we already were doing, like vaudeville and dancing and live orchestras and things like that, what DeForest was using, his technology, he used his tube as a detector, his triode tube, but he also used for his transmitter, not his tube, because it wasn't ready to oscillate yet, not till like 1915 or 1916. He used an arc system, a Polson-like arc system, as many people did, because the quality was better. You could generate a high-frequency arc. So anyway, DeForest was doing this. He claims to have sent out opera. The New York Times wrote it in their newspapers. And this is what separates the people who do things and say, I did this, I was early, is this kind of evidence. So when you're doing research and you see something in the New York Times, it's a pretty credible source, you know. They didn't have Breitbart News back then. But anyway, DeForest used the telephone as an earphone because he had a transceiver. It wasn't just a transmitter, but he could also listen to somebody calling back and saying, yes, we hear your opera singer. He used a carbon telephone microphone, which every radio broadcaster would use into the middle and late 1920s. So he used, and he also had a phonograph there. If you can see it, it's not very obvious to see, but he had a phonograph, and the phonograph was next to the microphone, carbon microphone of the telephone, to send out music. So, I mean, this was how it began. It was very crude, but it honestly began with the idea that people like DeForest and Fessenden needed to make some money, and they wanted to get some patents on some devices that allowed to do what Marconi did for the wired telegraph, that is, make the telephone wireless. Now, this is something, when I had done the DeForest book, I started to get things in the mail, and I got one thing from this Frank Butler's relative, saying something to the effect of, they sent me a DeForest book, a copy of Father of Radio, which has been in perfect shape with dust jacket. You know, you always want one of these, right? It was autographed, and inside was this picture of DeForest technology used for this 1906 device, or 1907. It says it was this sort of equipment, and through these two headphones that a voice of Madame Farrar was heard at Brooklyn Navy Yard in October 1907, and being the first woman to sing on the air. And this was Frank Butler, which is one of DeForest's assistants, and I was sent that by the Butler family. DeForest made actual radio telephones, as you can see, and these are around. I hope we have one here. Do we have one of these? We should have one. Anyway, these were used in early broadcast stations, but they were really not sold for that. DeForest was not necessarily a broadcaster. Now we come to Charles Harold of San Jose, and the reason that we say things about Harold is because he left a lot of stuff. He left a lot of papers. There's a lot of what we call evidence. There were some people alive in the 1950s that Gordon Greb interviewed. I think the voice of Harold, Len will have in his presentation, which is after lunch. But Charles Harold had a school called the Harold College of Wireless and Engineering. Now, Harold was a fake. Even though he did know mechanical things and he understood things, he was still, and probably did do all he said he did, but even though Harold went to Stanford University, which is pretty unusual for anybody to go to college back in 1900, I think, when he was born in 1875, so about 1900, he did go to Stanford. He dropped out after a few years. But a few years later, we have copies of Harold's stationery, which says, Charles Harold, PhD, BSCC, or BS Broadcast Engineer, BSEE, Electrical Engineering, but he called himself Doc Harold. He claimed he had a PhD, but he didn't, I find that distasteful because it was my job as a department head to hire people and find out about them, make sure they were real. But one thing you can say is that radio broadcasting did begin in the university. And there are a couple of examples I will show you. The university or the trade school, as Harold's school was, and it served a valuable purpose. It trained people for World War I code jobs. Some of those people were trained. But anyway, most of radio broadcasting, I found in my research, did occur and did take place in university classrooms in physics and engineering, and the students took an interest in it. It was always the students, and you see here, the students are the ones who were on the microphone. Harold is standing rather pretentiously in the door holding a slide rule, having done something with it, I suppose. Anybody here ever use a slide rule?
Yeah.
It's our stuff. I know. Anyway, his students were what they say were broadcasting, and Harold did get patents. For example, 6 singing arcs that would burn under alcohol and would correct themselves as they burned out, like the arcs in the old motion picture projectors. You had to sort of trim the arcs and get them closer so they'd be brighter. And this was a high-frequency DC arc, and you can see it. He did receive a patent for it. All of his patents, we were told, would probably not have survived, but since radio broadcasting and voice went to vacuum tube, it wouldn't have mattered, even though he was given those. His antenna coupled these 2 coils together for broadcasting, and his microphone was water-cooled, a water-cooled telephone microphone. We have a couple of those at History San Jose, and I took a bunch apart. I took them apart, actually. I didn't hurt them. I put them back together. And I took photographs and close-ups and that sort of thing, which I think some of those are in the Harold book, but I'm not sure. It's been such a long, long time ago. Harold's wife and son are doing their weekly program, and I interviewed the little baby. I interviewed him for the Charles Harold documentary. He died a few years after that because he was very, very old. He was probably in his almost 100 years old, but he talked about that, and he was interested in what was going on at the laboratory, and that was Harold's wife, who she left him, I guess, in the middle 20s for somebody with a real job, maybe a real PhD, I don't know. But the evidence for Harold's work, which kind of passes muster with all the historians who say, well, maybe he wasn't a real broadcaster because there was no licensing for broadcasting, but those aren't necessarily the definitions. What it says here in the Electro Importing Catalog, which is Hugo Gernsback, this was the Electro Importing Catalog of January 1910. They sold Harold the equipment. He couldn't get him in San Jose. He bought him a mail order from New York. So they said, well, maybe you can send us a notarized statement showing how you're using the parts you bought from us. And so what Harold says, it's circled here, and I think I can memorized it. Harold said on this notarized statement, "We have been giving wireless concerts to amateur men in the Santa Clara Valley." That shows known audience. It shows intent to send out content. It shows the area. And so some people think this is serious. Now, when I did the work on Charles Herald, it was different than when Gordon Greb did the original research in 1950. There were fights between KDKA and KCBS as to who was first. Well, of course, they're owned by the same company now. Or maybe they're not anymore. Maybe that company's gone. But anyway, that was important in the 50s. When I did this work on Herald, the documentary in 1995, the book in 2003, no one cared that much about history or who was first. And so the Herald story still, to my sadness, with the exception of a few professors who use it in their classrooms, the Herald story is still largely a local story, largely forgotten, as the documentary is called, The Forgotten Father of Broadcasting. This other one was 1912, and it shows the San Jose Herald author, the reporter, says that he is in there in Herald's radio station. He didn't call it radio station, Herald's laboratory, and the students are sending music using this strange device, and the phone rings, and the student picks it up, and it's a request for music. And then the student says, okay, we'll play the record. They play the record, they crank up the phonograph and play it on that contraption you saw on the earlier slide. And so this is actually the act of radio broadcasting, although no one called it then that. They called it wireless concert. Anyhow, so this was in the newspaper, and it was important enough that, but this is just like what? It's just like radio, right? I mean, just down the street from where the Herald station was located, it was at 1st and San Fernando. If you go down a few blocks to 5th and San Fernando, you're at San Jose State University, and right there next to the library is KSJS, the station I supervised for so many years. Okay, so Charles Herald did this, and we know it, and that's that. Okay. Here is the famous mural, which I photographed at Wisconsin-Madison. This was Earl Terry, who was a professor and the precursor to WHA. He and his students experimented. They told fellow faculty members, go home and turn on this device. I'll put in your room there. It's a crude receiver, and you can hear music coming from the laboratory, right? And this was pre-World War I. You actually see a little piano trio over there in the corner. So I don't know. This is a fanciful kind of a very detailed, a very, very detailed mural, which is still there. And then again, the school I went to, Ohio State, there's their early pre-1920 control board. And again, we talk about radio being formed from parts from telephone and telegraph and arc systems and all that. This board has telephone patch boards, sockets in it. It has common voltmeters that were used. There's a loudspeaker hanging on the wall here, which uses a giant piece of cardboard to amplify. It's kind of like our PA system here. Yeah. So anyway, this is important, and this is what every typical radio studio looked like. If you can see it, it's lots and lots of drapes hanging, a piano, of course, and a microphone. And why did some of these college stations survive and go on to become real stations, but most of them did not survive? And I point to this old geezer here in front of the microphone who was president in 1922 of Ohio State. The university supported this. Wisconsin, Madison supported it too, because there was the Wisconsin plan that said we should get education into every home in Wisconsin. And they didn't even know about radio when they actually made up this so-called plan. So this was important. DeForest in 1916 did the election returns, and who was the guy? It was Wilson and Hughes, and we always hear about KDKA 4 years later with Harding and Cox, but Wilson and Hughes election, which Wilson of course won. DeForest did this in New York. He claimed he was playing records between sending out messages. He didn't think about I'm a broadcaster, I don't think, because they didn't even use that word back then for what he did. So. Anyway, so this is the kinds of things, and the decades sort of ended. with those kinds of experiments, but it ended with a couple of years where most people were off the air because of the wartime restrictions. Conrad was an exception. He was allowed to experiment with some vacuum tubes, and so he did what Fessenden said he did, and he played music on a phonograph and put a microphone in front of it. There are a couple of photos of that. I don't know, this may be an early photo of KDKA in Pittsburgh, but they used for the very first time, well, actually, DeForest was the first time, but they used DeForest Oscillion as a high-frequency oscillator to send broadcasting out. And so all of this happened between 1900 and 1920. We went from where there were actually no broadcast stations and no voice communication to a place where we can now send out music and talk, but we didn't know what to do with it. People were coming back from the war. They needed something. They needed some excitement. Conrad actually went on the air, and it was a big deal. You know, all pre-1920 radio was experimental, but and mostly the people who were involved were the kids, right? And they found out information through talking to each other in books. So I'll conclude this with the radio decade, which is 1920 to 1930, because between 1920 and 1930, in 1930, radio was a fully formed industry. It was fully formed with programming and technology and dial placement. Now, creating the radio audience was what had to happen, because the technology was sort of there. Still, if it was just the kids with a crystal set, a crystal detector, and headphones, it was still a bit of an experimental curiosity. But if we could somehow figure out how to amplify that music and put it on a loudspeaker, it might actually attract the interest of the parents. And all of a sudden, you start to see an audience being created. Well, I wrote this book on boys and girls. They always built their own little crystal sets. Eventually, they brought their parents in, and they said, "Gee, Dad, can I have some money. I've got to get a tube because I've got to have an amplifier." And then they would say, "Gee, you know, I've got to have a loudspeaker." In one of these books, one of the kids steals the ear trumpet from a deaf grandma and fits an earphone piece to it. This is how the first horn speaker was made, of course. It was a earphone and an amplifier. Like that thing that I'm talking out of back there is Steve's little teeny tiny Radio Shack amplifier, and it's blasting out of that amplifier back there. So in a sense, we've gone back in time to the early days. So these books were important because they allowed kids to visit each other's homes. Just like Bart was saying, what the adults did for so-called radio dances, the kids did the same thing. And this was kind of early social media. In a sense, you'd sit around and listen to whatever was on that night from New York, and then you'd switch it over after they'd go off the air and listen to Boston or Louisville, Kentucky, you know, depending on where you were. And this was a way to meet people and actually learn what was going on. Books. The ABC of radio and the home radio, how to make it and how to use it, these were how people got guidance, because there wasn't guidance, there weren't classes on this. There were books and magazines, right, and newspapers. And this is what these media began to help people develop the next media, which was radio. Interestingly, these things were called radio concerts, radio telephone concerts, radio phone, but not yet called broadcasting. This book, which is very interesting, ABC of Radio, starts out in the very first page by asking the question, and the question is, where does radio come from? My window is closed, and yet I hear music. How innocent that is. This is 1922, you know. Some people wondered about that. You can't see radio waves. You can't see them. You know they're there because some scientist tells you so. But, gee, I don't know. Here's a very important book called Radio Enters the Home by the RCA, sort of a licensed government trust which allowed different companies to work together, pooling their patents. So it's important in a way after the war. Radio Enters the Home did a bunch of things. It had a bunch of chapters which explained what radio was all about. And it also had chapters on how to build very simple radios, but then it was also a catalog where you could buy parts and you could buy ready-made radios. So this is a very important book. You can still get it today. I bought it, I guess, as a reprint, but it's black and white, so it looks fine. It also, in this book and in these boys and girls books, and I think this is from one of the boys and girls book, Here is kind of a block diagram of what? A crystal set. Very basic. You see there's an antenna and ground. You can see there's a tuning coil. This one with the slider on it. You know, some of the more sophisticated ones like Bart's had tapped coils, which made it a little more positive, I guess, to know where you were. A crystal detector, a condenser, and a receiver, they called it back then, which was really an earphone. It's a telephone earphone. There was two of them. You know, same thing, magnetic, a diaphragm, you know, magnetic coil wrapped around the electromagnet. Yeah. Yeah, and again, they made these for radio reception as well as this Bart showed you already, the oatmeal box. I used Bart's stuff to photograph for some of these books. A close-up of a cat whisker, which I'm not even sure if it's a real cat whisker. And then the headphone. These were good quality headphones. Brandis, I guess they were. The same thing, only using a vacuum tube, not as an amplifier because you're still using a receiver, earphone, but as a detector. And the only thing different, of course, was the addition of the battery for the filament, not the heater, because you know nowadays we have a heater and a cathode wrapped around the glowing thing, which the electrons come off of the actual cathode. With this thing, there is just a filament which is coated. Anybody want to? Is that correct? Essentially, thank you, John. I look at John Staples. Yeah, good. Okay, so anyway, and of course a B battery. Yes. Okay. Now the most important person in the early 1920s, the most important person was Hugo Gernsback, who started with magazines in the early part of the 20th century for young kids, and also catalogs like the Herald one I explained, where kids could buy parts to build their radios. And Gernsback was very important. He came to USA in 1905. He published over 50 magazines. The Hugo Awards were named after him because his early magazines were science fiction. He had some of the famous science fiction writers write for his magazine in the middle 1920s. So amazing stories. That's it. 1908, Modern Electrics, and electrician and mechanic. These were pre, when you didn't even think about broadcasting. You were just a kid and you had a crystal set and you wanted to, or you had hooked an antenna up to your electric lawnmower, or Tesla coil, sure, that's that sort of thing. So all this information was very important. And Gernsback, for example, did predictions in every one of his issues, and this is a very, very popular. This is the most popular magazine in the early 1920s. It's for radio, and this is Radio Amateur. You see, Radio Amateur News in 1920. They changed the name a few months later and took out the word amateur because all of a sudden we were realizing it's not just kids anymore, but the adults have this possibility of radio. And his article here, Dancing by Radio Phone, shows all of these people dancing. They all have earphones on, and their wires are kind of mixed up, and they're hooked to the ceiling, and they're twisting around each other, and they're probably drinking a lot, as Bart indicated. But anyway, this is how you interested people who didn't know anything except live music or live on-stage vaudeville to try something like radio broadcasting, even though they called it radio concerts. They didn't call it radio broadcasting. So this is Dancing by Radio Telephone. He predicted that. This is 1920, and he predicts that music will help to sell radio to the public, radio concerts. Well, we sort of knew that because, you know, Harold and DeForest and a few others were sending out music, but he saw it in a way, not with the DJ, but with the orchestra and with some way of getting people to listen with the popular music of the day. So this is, Gernsback was a smart guy, a savvy guy. He built his reputation and his business on predicting in all of these issues. Here's an interesting one. You see a fire burning in the background. Reporting news by radio is the title of the article. And I would have thought, as a guy who was in a communication program for a long time, that this is just what we know it is, that at this time in 1920, I believe that is, yes, 1920, that we're actually going out and sending reporters out on the scene to broadcast live news. This is not the case at all. There are no radio news departments. What this story tells us is that this newsman, who is a reporter, with a two-way shortwave receiver, goes out to cover it. he's reporting back to the desk of the local newspaper, and the editor gets his story, puts it in a special, and sends it out as an extra. So we still have that old newspaper model. See, we're not changing as quickly as we think we are. It does change, and it really takes until the middle 30s when the newspapers got really upset at radio stations reading their newspaper on the air. But this is still a newspaper-centered world. So this is happening very slowly, but Gernsback is saying, well, it's happening. Okay, here's a strange thing. This is an opera, sending an opera and broadcasting simultaneously and seeing an actual opera in New York and San Francisco. What happens is the opera singers in costume go into a film studio. They make a film of a half-hour opera. Then they make a copy, send it to San Francisco. Then in New York, on the radio, which also is simultaneously broadcast in San Francisco. The singers are actually there, and they sing the opera synchronized to the motion picture in two different cities. It's fascinating. I mean, a lot of work, you know. I mean, and of course it was DeForest, as I say in my DeForest book, who was one of the pioneers of putting the sound right on the film soundtrack. Very, very important stuff. Here's something that's kind of interesting, and this is by 1923 when radio is pretty much fully formed and there are stations on the air and people can listen with loudspeakers. This is something that when I was in radio, there were problems with licensing because the record companies always said, well, if you play our records on the air, then people will not buy them. And the radio station said, well, if we play your records on the air, people will go out and buy them. And then this happened again, and it's still going on with the internet, because if you want to stream music, it actually costs more than the old radio licensing system, which is still in effect. And here's what Gernsback said. I have to read this. The whole country has been watching with interest, and we believe with considerable annoyance as well, the fight between the music publishers and authors conducted against radio broadcasting station. The controversy in brief is that the music publishers and authors insist that the broadcasting stations pay them a royalty on the music composition, and until this payment is forthcoming, they refuse to let the broadcasting use their music. They claim this right under copyright law. Well, this never stops. This has been going on for 100 years, right? All right, let's see here. Okay, and finally, Gernsback, in an article in his magazine, talks about radio to supplant universities. Well, it actually did. Ohio State, being one of the important schools in radio education, actually had what they called like a junior college of the air, where people could listen to the radio, and they'd go into the school maybe and take a test once every semester. When that died out, education by television, which is awful, professors standing near blackboards, right, like me, and that happened in the 1950s, so-called educational television. But this was also going on before all that. So there it is. All right. Okay, so in the 1920s, stations continued to be licensed. More stations were licensed than ever survived because everybody wanted a radio station. You know, grandma's furniture store, car dealers, appliance stores were popular. Electric appliance stores, they were popular because the owner typically knew something about how to build a transmitter. All these people got licenses, but they couldn't figure a way to monetize it. They didn't know how to do it. They'd bring in their relatives who played accordion. Your Uncle John was going to play the accordion again. And because it was free, because he didn't charge, he got to be on the radio. So anyway, many stations lost their licenses, and many were tossed off the air as the 1920s progressed because they did not meet certain standards. The transition from earphones to horn and cone speakers, obviously that was all during the 1920s. We started with kids listening to crystal sets. We ended up with big-time radios. The 1920s radio dial doesn't look at all like it did by the end of the here. This is a wall of radios. This is an old-fashioned museum somewhere. Bellingham. It's Bellingham, actually. Yeah. And then, of course, by the end of the decade, we had console radios with built-in speakers. They plugged into the electric. That was a big deal. All electric radios. They were easy to use. It's kind of like computers. People never really wanted to use computers because they were too complex. But then you get a smartphone. It's really simple. You just touch it and you get it. I mean, so we have to do what the public wants, right? And We gave them one single knob tuning. The Radio Act of 1927, which was changed to the Communications Act of 1934, with not being changed very much, except adding telephone and what they call common carrier. But the Radio Act of 1927, the most important thing it did, and it was regulatory, of course, it took the regulation away from the Commerce Department and created the Federal Radio Commission, the FRC, which was changed a few years later to the FCC. What it did that was most important and most significant was that it divided the spectrum into local 250 watt to 1,000 watt stations, regional 5,000 watt stations, clear channel 50,000 watts, because as you drove across the country, sometimes you can only get big clear channel stations. They sorted it out. They did it scientifically, just like they did TV channels in 1949, 1950. The TV freeze period. This was like the radio freeze. They changed everybody and gave everybody a frequency and told them how long they could be on the air. And obviously it's much more complex than that. Advertising, beginning early in the 20s with WEAF and their famous commercial for a housing development in New York. Spot announcements seemed to be the one. Technology was easier. There were networks. There was CBS and NBC by then. ABC would come around 1940. Programming was developed, networks were formed, and advertising was successful as a financial basis of radio. So it really happened from about 1922 to about 1926 or so. And Amos and Andy was the most listened to program. Shows us where we're at, you know. Okay, and that's all I have to say about broadcasting. So thank you very much.